She bet her horse for his freedom, and won. The sun over Oakhaven didn't set so much as it surrendered. It sank behind the jagged teeth of the Blackwood Range, casting long, bruised shadows across a town that had forgotten the meaning of its own name. Oakhaven was no longer a sanctuary. It was a ledger, and every soul in it was written in red ink. By the autumn of 1884, the Ironwood Syndicate had moved in. They didn't arrive with the thunder of an army, they came with the scratch of fountain pens and the quiet clink of gold. They were a machine, a system of lawyers, land agents, and soft-spoken men in charcoal suits who understood that you didn't need to kill a man to take what he owned. You only had to make his life unaffordable. Elias Thorne was the last holdout. He was 70 years old, with skin like cured leather and hands that had carved a ranch out of the scrub brush when the Apache still held the water rights. He was a man of the old world, a world of handshakes and hard-won boundaries. But the syndicate didn't value the old world. They valued the path of the coming rail line. They didn't offer Elias a fair price. Instead, they manufactured a debt. A phantom lien on his cattle, a sudden tax from a corrupt county seat, and finally, a charge of rustling that everyone in town knew was a lie. But in Oakhaven, the truth was a luxury no one could afford to whisper. They didn't put Elias in a cell. That would have been too hidden. Instead, they shackled him to a hitching post in the center of the town square, under the unblinking eye of the midday sun. They put an iron collar around his neck, the kind used for chain gangs, and waited. They weren't waiting for him to confess. They were waiting for his spirit to break so he would sign the deed to his land. For 3 days, the townspeople passed him by. They looked at their boots. They tucked their children's heads into their skirts. They felt the shame of it, but they felt the fear more. To help Elias was to invite the syndicate's ledgers into your own home. By the third evening, Elias's head hung low. His lips were cracked, and his breath came in ragged, shallow whistles. The syndicate's local enforcer, a man named Silas Vane, sat on the porch of the hotel across the square, whittling a piece of cedar and watching the old man die by inches. The silence of the town was total. It was the silence of a community that had accepted its own defeat. Then, from the dust of the South Trail, came a sound that didn't belong to the syndicate's world. It was the steady, rhythmic strike of a single horse's hooves, heavy, purposeful, and slow. The machine was about to meet a ghost. The dust cloud was small, no bigger than a man's pride, but it moved with an unwavering intent. As it drew closer, it resolved into the figure of a woman on horseback. She was not a common sight in Oakhaven, where the women kept to the homes or the saloons, never venturing far from the established paths. This woman moved like she owned the land beneath her, every muscle in her mare rippling with controlled power. The horse was a charcoal gray, almost black in the shadows, with a coat that shimmered even under the relentless sun. Her name was Cinder, and she was a legend whispered among horse traders from Santa Fe to the Klamath River, a creature of speed and endurance, born of wild mustang and thoroughbred grace. Her presence alone was enough to draw the few brave souls out of the shadows. Even Silas Vane, perched on the hotel porch, paused his whittling and allowed his gaze to linger. The horse was a thing of beauty, a defiant spark in a town smothered by the mundane. The woman herself, though slight of frame, carried a stillness that suggested deep waters. Her face was weathered, marked by sun and wind, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much and judged little. She wore practical riding clothes, dusted by the trail, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of her expression. She didn't head for the general store, nor the livery. She didn't seek the comfort of the hotel or the services of the doctor, who would have been surprised to see a new face. Her destination was clear and unwavering, the Scarlet Garter Saloon, the unofficial headquarters of the Ironwood Syndicate in Oakhaven. She dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of long hours in the saddle, tying Cinder's reins to the very hitching post where Elias Thorne, the old man, sat shackled. The mare dipped her head and nudged Elias's hand gently with her muzzle, a silent communion passing between the two creatures. Elias, who had seemed beyond comfort, slowly lifted his gaze. A flicker of something that might have been hope, or simply recognition of a kindred spirit, passed through his weary eyes. The woman paused, her back to the saloon doors, and looked at Elias. There was no pity in her eyes, only a deep, quiet understanding. She reached into her saddlebag, pulled out a canteen, and offered it to the old man. He drank deeply, the water tracing clean paths down his dust-streaked chin. Silas Vane, whose authority was absolute in Oakhaven, stood up from his porch chair, the movement slow and deliberate. "That's a lot of horse for one woman, stranger," he called out, his voice smooth but edged with curiosity and a hint of something more predatory. The woman turned, her face now fully visible, though unreadable. "She's the fastest thing between the Missouri and the coast," she replied, her voice low and steady, like stones rolling in a dry riverbed. "And she's the only thing I own." Vane smiled, a shark's grin. "Why tell me, ma'am? I'm not looking to buy." "Because you like to gamble, Mr. Vane," the woman said, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "And I want the old man." The words hung in the air, audacious and clear. A single life, weighed against a legendary horse. The quiet town held its breath, waiting for the ripple effect of this impossible declaration. The Scarlet Garter smelled of stale whiskey, sawdust, and the nervous sweat of men who had long since traded their souls for a steady wage. When Clara stepped inside, every pair of eyes in the room turned to her, then to Silas Vane. The syndicate's director, a man accustomed to subtle power, seemed to relish the public spectacle. He gestured to a small, scarred table in the corner, a table that had seen more fortunes won and lost than a dozen gold claims. "5-card stud, ma'am," Vane declared, his voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. "Dealer's choice on the ante, but the stakes are clear. My win, I take the horse. Your win, the old man walks free, debts cleared, deed returned, and the syndicate forgets his name." Clara nodded. "Agreed." She sat down opposite Vane, her movements economical, her gaze steady. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet resolve. Vane found himself unnerved by it, accustomed as he was to the desperate pleas or blustering challenges of men. A deck of cards, worn smooth by countless hands, was produced. The dealer, a man with eyes as dead as a desert fossil, shuffled with practiced ease. This wasn't just a game of chance, it was a ritual, a public affirmation of the syndicate's dominion. As the first cards were dealt face down, the air in the saloon grew heavy. This wasn't merely a wager between a woman and a man. It was a clash of two opposing forces. Vane represented the New West, the West of fine print, of systematic exploitation, of turning human lives into columns in a ledger. He was the architect of a slow, creeping rut that was replacing the untamed frontier with something far more insidious, corporate control. "You're a fool," Vane whispered across the table, his voice low enough not to be heard by the others, but laced with a viper's hiss. He glanced at his own hand, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "You're betting a fortune on a man who's already dead in the eyes of the law, a man who will just get into debt again." Clara looked at her own hidden cards, her expression unreadable. "I'm betting on what's right," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "The law hasn't reached these parts yet, Mr. Vane. Only men have. And some men still remember what a life is worth." As the game progressed, the layers of the syndicate's operation began to reveal themselves, not through words, but through the environment. Through the smudged window of the saloon, a file of shackled men and women shuffled past, guarded by two grim-faced riders. They were not outlaws, they were the dispossessed, the indebted, being moved like cattle to the syndicate's hidden silver mines further north. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty. They were not prisoners of a crime, but victims of a system. A collective gasp went through the saloon. This wasn't just about Elias Thorne and his ranch. It was about the slow, agonizing theft of an entire way of life. It was about the syndicate turning the frontier into a vast, silent plantation of the desperate, their souls traded for copper and silver. The moral scope of the room expanded beyond a single game, encompassing the systematic evil that had taken root in the land. Vane noticed the shift in the room's mood, a flicker of unease even in his hardened men. He saw it in the fear in the eyes of his own dealer. He needed to win this hand, not just for the horse, but to reassert the syndicate's unshakable authority. He needed to prove that resistance was not only futile but costly. He slid a stack of chips forward, matching Clara's silent bet. "The price of doing what's right can be very high, ma'am," he said, leaning back, confident in his hand. "Sometimes, it costs you everything." Clara met his gaze. "Sometimes," she said, her voice betraying nothing, "the true cost is paid by those who think they can take everything." She pushed her own stack of chips forward, completing the bet. The final cards were about to be dealt. The air crackled with the unspoken tension, a silent countdown to a reckoning that would either cement the syndicate's power or shatter it. The dealer's hands were steady, but the room was not. The silence in the Scarlet Garter had become something physical, a pressure in the ears that made the ticking of the wall clock sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The final card slid across the wood. Silas Vane didn't look at his card immediately. He looked at Clara. He wanted to see the crack in the stone, the moment when the realization of loss hit her eyes. He wanted to see her understand that her legendary horse now belonged to a ledger in a Chicago office. "The thing about systems, ma'am," Vane said, his voice dropping to a confidential purr, "is that they are designed to win. It isn't luck. It's math. It's the weight of the bank against the hunger of the individual." He turned his cards over. One by one. A jack of hearts. A jack of spades. A jack of diamonds. "Three of a kind," Vane announced. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The three jacks sat on the table like a stone wall, impassable and cold. He reached out his hand, his fingers hovering just inches from the deed to Elias Thorne's ranch. "A beautiful horse, Clara. I'll see she's treated as well as any piece of high-value machinery." Clara didn't reach for the deed. She didn't even look at the pot. Her eyes remained fixed on Vane, not with anger, but with a profound, weary pity. "You speak of math, Mr. Vane," she said softly. "But you've forgotten how to count the things that matter." She turned her cards. The 6 of diamonds. The 8 of diamonds. The 9, the 10, and finally, the king. A flush. 5 cards, all the color of a sunset over the scrub brush. All the color of the blood Elias Thorne had spilled into this soil for 40 years. The room didn't erupt. It exhaled. It was the sound of 100 men holding their breath and finally letting it go. The wall of jacks had been bypassed, not by force, but by a higher order of play. Vane's hand froze. The color drained from his face, leaving it the gray of wet ash. The math had failed. The system had been beaten at its own game, in front of the very people it sought to enslave. This was more than a lost hand, it was a public execution of the syndicate's invincibility. "You cheated," Vane hissed. His hand moved toward the edge of the table, not toward the cards, but toward the holster hidden beneath the wood. He never made it. The violence was not a spectacle, it was a surgical strike. Before Vane's fingers could even brush the leather of his grip, Clara was standing. She didn't draw a gun, not yet. She simply leaned forward and drove a small, bone-handled skinning knife through Vane's sleeve, pinning his arm to the heavy oak table. As the two guards by the door reached for their revolvers, Clara's other hand appeared from beneath her coat. A Colt Patterson, old but meticulously kept. 2 shots rang out, swift, purposeful, and decisive. One shattered the lantern hanging above the guards, showering them in glass and darkness. The other took the thumb off the hammer of the lead guard's pistol. "The game is over," Clara said, her voice carrying the weight of a mountain. "The deed is won. The man is free." She reached out, took the paper from the table, and tucked it into her vest. She looked at Vane, who was staring at his pinned arm in a state of shock. "You can keep the cards, Silas," she whispered. "But the land belongs to those who bleed for it." She turned and walked out the swinging doors. Behind her, for the first time in years, the people of Oakhaven began to speak to one another in voices that were no longer whispers. The swinging doors of the Scarlet Garter settled with a rhythmic, dying slap. Outside, the world was still bathed in that thick, amber light that precedes a storm. Clara didn't run. She walked with the deliberate pace of a woman who had already seen the end of the day. In the center of the square, the iron collar around Elias Thorne's neck looked heavier than it had an hour ago. He had heard the shots. He had seen the guard stumble out of the saloon, clutching ruined hands and wounded pride. He looked up as Clara approached, his eyes clouded with a mixture of disbelief and a terrifying kind of hope. Clara reached into her belt and pulled out a heavy iron key, taken from the belt of the guard she had disarmed. There was no fanfare. She knelt in the dust, the charcoal gray mare, Cinder, standing guard behind her like a silent sentinel. The lock turned with a dry, metallic groan. As the collar fell into the dirt, it made a sound like a spent shell casing hitting a floorboard. Elias didn't move at first. He rubbed his neck, the skin there raw and purpled, looking at the iron as if it were a venomous snake. "It's done, Elias," Clara said quietly. She pressed the deed to his ranch into his trembling hand. "The syndicate's paper is ash now." But as Elias stood, his legs buckling from days of standing in the sun, the reckoning took on a darker hue. From the shadows of the livery and the porches of the general store, the townspeople began to emerge. They didn't come to celebrate. They stood in a wide, ragged circle, looking at Elias, then at the saloon, then at each other. The silence was broken by the sound of heavy wheels. A wagon, one of the syndicate's transport carts, sat idling at the edge of town, filled with the indebted travelers Clara had seen earlier. The guards had fled, leaving the driver uncertain. Clara looked at the townspeople. "He is free," she said, gesturing to Elias. "But the road behind you is still full of chains. Are you going to watch them pass, or are you going to remember your men?" It was a quiet question, but it carried the force of a landslide. The moral weight of their long silence seemed to crush the townspeople for a moment, and then, it broke. A blacksmith stepped forward, then a shopkeeper. They didn't grab guns, they grabbed hammers and pry bars. They walked toward the transport wagon not with the chaos of a mob, but with the grim, purposeful energy of people performing a long overdue chore. The syndicate's system relied on the illusion of inevitability. Clara had shattered that illusion with 5 cards and 2 bullets. Now, the machine was stalling. Elias looked at the deed, then looked at Clara. "I can't pay you," he rasped, his voice cracked from thirst. "I have nothing but the dirt in that house." Clara mounted Cinder, the mare shifting restlessly as the first scent of rain hit the air. "You already paid, Elias. You stayed standing when everyone else sat down. That's a rare currency in these parts." She looked back at the scarlet garter. Silas Vane was being carried out, his arm a mess of red and white, his authority bleeding out into the dust. He would live, but he would never again be the man whose word was law. He was just a man who had lost a hand of cards. The balance of power in Oakhaven had shifted, not toward a new master, but back to the people who built it. But as the first heavy drops of rain began to crater the dust, the victory felt somber. The land had been stained, and while the chains were off, the scars remained. The rain finally came, but it did not wash the town clean. It turned the dust into a thick, red clay that clung to the boots of the liberated and the defeated alike. In the sudden coolness of the evening, the violence of the afternoon felt like a fever that had broken, leaving the body weak and trembling. Clara sat tall in the saddle, watching as the blacksmith hammered the locks off the transport wagon. She watched as the dispossessed stepped down into the mud, blinking at a freedom they hadn't expected to see again. There was no cheering. There was only the sound of the rain and the low, guttural sobbing of those who had realized the nightmare was over. Elias Thorne walked to the edge of the square, clutching his deed as if it were a holy relic. He looked out toward his ranch, a silhouette against the darkening hills. He was a free man, but he was an old man, and his land was a lonely place. "Where will you go?" Elias asked, turning back to the woman on the charcoal gray mare. Clara looked toward the north, where the clouds were thickest. "Where the wind goes, Elias. There are other towns where the ledgers are full and the people are quiet." "You could stay," he said, his voice barely audible over the downpour. "There's work. There's a home." Clara shook her head slowly. The brim of her hat channeled the rain into a steady stream before her face. "I am a gambler, Elias. And a gambler never stays at a table once the winning hand is played. It spoils the luck." She turned Cinder toward the edge of town. As she rode, the townspeople parted for her. They didn't reach out to touch her hand or shout her name. They looked at her with a heavy, mythic reverence, the way men look at a lightning strike after the thunder has faded. She was no longer just a woman to them, she was the physical manifestation of a debt being settled. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the Ironwood Syndicate had abandoned Oakhaven. Without the fear, the system had no fuel. The lawyers and the agents packed their ledgers into black carriages and vanished before the mud could dry, leaving behind only the empty offices and the iron collar lying in the square. Elias Thorne lived another 10 years on his land. He never married, and he never sold an acre. When he died, they found the deed to his ranch tucked inside an old Bible, and next to it, a single playing card, the King of Diamonds. The story of the woman who bet her horse for a stranger's freedom became a part of the local lore, whispered around campfires and told to children when the world seemed too dark and the powerful seemed too large. They say she wasn't just a woman, but the spirit of the Old West itself, unyielding, expensive, and gone before you can say thank you. But the lesson of Oakhaven remained carved into the minds of those who survived it. They learned that a system is only as strong as the silence of the people it governs. And they learned that while gold can buy land and ledgers can buy labor, they can never truly own the soul of a person who knows the value of a single, honest hand. The town grew, the rails eventually came, and the syndicate returned in different names and different suits. But they never forgot. For as long as the wind blew through the Blackwood Range, the shadow of a charcoal gray mare remained, a silent warning to those who would weigh a human life in silver. Everything has a price. And sometimes, the person willing to pay it is the one you least expect.